Well, okay, this is just plain mean. Right now, I'm still in Utah, but the photos are from the resort on Vahini Island in French Polynesia, where we'll be staying in the last week in October. And then we move on to New Zealand to take a hiking trip. But don't worry, the disembodied voice remains behind. Okay, now I'm done being mean. On to Pacific art. This podcast will be less long-winded, partly because many of the themes are the same, and partly because I want you to have some time to start thinking about your presentations. I'll open with the same comment that I made about Africa. We are talking about a huge area with a great disparity in cultures. In the case of Oceania, however, there is certainly at least one uniting theme. These are people whose lives are dominated by the ocean. Anthropologists usually divide the region into four groupings, which you see here: Australia, Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia. Note that New Zealand really belongs in Polynesia. Its native Maori people emigrated to the island from Polynesia. Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, and Hawaii are also considered part of Polynesia. Easter Island is just too far east to appear on this map. You should recognize these two works from our prehistoric art unit. Both are from Melanesia, the ambum stone from Papua New Guinea and the geometrically carved Lapita terracotta fragment from the Solomon Islands. Do you remember who the Lapita people were and why they're so important to the history of the Pacific? They're believed to have migrated from Southeast Asia, bringing some of their Neolithic technology, plants, and animals with them. And they're the ancestors of modern-day Micronesians, Polynesians, and some of the people of the Melanesian coastal areas. As the map made pretty clear, this is a geographic area dominated by ocean. The skill to navigate oceans, to use ocean resources, and to survive ocean weather is central to thriving in this region. Actually, many of the voyages of Polynesian sailors are as technically impressive and personally courageous as the voyages of European explorers. In fact, the Pacific is really bigger and scarier than the Atlantic. I suspect that the centrality of the ocean to Pacific art, in fact it's often called oceanic art, is a reason why the College Board included this navigation chart in its list of required works. You'll learn what the sticks and shells stand for, and that this chart wasn't actually taken to sea, where presumably it was too fragile. Instead, it was memorized on land. Yep, I'm recycling one, in fact, several of my Africa slides here. But the point carries through to Pacific art as well. And, of course, it's reflected in the essay test question for your unit test. Here we see a female deity from Micronesia. Both the statue and its placement in a temple or a cult house where offerings would be brought to the image during the harvest. For the period of these rituals, the sculptures were considered a resting place of a god or a deified ancestor spirit. Actually, this is a modern-day cult house. I couldn't find an image of one from this particular culture. Similarly, the ahu ula, or feather cape, was far more than a decoration. These were symbols of high rank and could only be worn by chiefs or people in their class. Chiefs wore them during ceremonies, but they also wore them into battle, as this 19th century illustration shows. No two capes had the same design, since each one told a very specific story about that chief's lineage and accomplishments. The colors were symbolic. Red in particular was the color of kings, much as purple became associated with kings in Europe. Yellow was valuable because yellow feathers were scarce. So why wear such a precious and presumably at least a little bit delicate work of art into battle? Well, the capes were thought to provide the chief with divine protection against an enemy's weapons, and given the extraordinarily dense and intricate weaving, it's possible that they did. Think of chainmail. Polynesian society in particular was highly socially stratified, with an aristocratic class. It's sometimes described with the term feudal, which of course is used for European, also for Japanese samurai society. Polynesian rulers sought to protect and enhance their mana. It's a complicated concept, and I doubt I understand it completely, but essentially mana is a kind of spiritual force. It emanates from the gods, but people possess it, and it's associated essentially with possessing power, effectiveness, and high standing in the community. So it captures a combination of efficacy, the ability to get things done, and prestige, social standing. Keeping, gaining, or losing mana was very important to leaders in these communities. This Austrian portrait of a Maori leader on the left and the tattoos on his face capture this individual's abundant mana. The word may originally, by the way, have derived from words for thunder, and this reflects the strong relationship between oceanic deities and religion and the forces of nature that dominated the lives of island people. I've mentioned that feathers had spiritual power in Hawaiian culture. On the left, you see a book mask from the Torres Strait. For this culture, animals, a number of different kinds of animals, had totemic powers. That is, they stood for certain spiritual forces. The image on the right, which is not your required work, shows a book mask shaped like a crocodile, surmounted, as is the bird-like book mask that is a required work, surmounted by a human face. Where have we seen these human-animal combinations before, and what kind of a message are they usually sending? So these masks were used in rituals where masked dancers would reenact episodes from the lives of ancestral heroes, legendary beings whose actions helped establish these societies according to the founding myths. The dancers evoked the power of the animals they portrayed, the flight of the birds, the fierce bite of the crocodile, just as, for example, the lamassu or the sphinx evoked the power of those animals, on behalf of the ruler. Well, I couldn't find any photos of a book mask performance, and I believe that most of what we know about this comes from early European visitors to the island. So here's another work that evokes the power of ancestors. The art of New Ireland traditionally centered on funerary ceremonies and feasts to honor the dead. In northern New Ireland, the name given to these elaborate ceremonies is Mulligan, which is also the term for the carved and painted sculptures that are associated both with funerary and, as we'll see in a minute, with coming-of-age rituals. The purpose of a Mulligan funeral ceremony is to send the souls of the deceased to the realm of the dead. At the climax of the ceremony, the commissioned Mulligan sculptures are exhibited in these temporary display houses. Each sculpture honors a specific individual and illustrates his or her relationship with ancestors, with clan totems, and or with living family members. It's intended to be a representation of an individual's soul or life force. Again, we're getting back to this concept of mana. It's not a direct portrait. During the course of the ceremony, the Mulligan are treated with utmost care, since it's believed that the souls of the deceased actually enter these sculptures. Once the souls leave the Mulligan and the world of the living, the sculptures are no longer needed, and they're usually burned or allowed to rot. Only the masks and musical instruments used during the ceremonies are preserved for future use. So can you think of other works we've studied that temporarily or permanently house a god or the spirit of the deceased? This is another common theme in art. These may be the most iconic ancestor statues in all of our history, although, as I hope our presenters explain, there's still a lot of debate about what they really mean. Power and authority were very important in Pacific cultures. I think they've really turned out to be important in every culture we've studied. But this was especially true in the more hierarchical cultures of Polynesia, which, as I mentioned, were dominated by a class of aristocrats. The weavers of the feather capes actually recited the wearer's genealogy as they were being woven, and this was to increase the power or mana of the cape. These capes were worn during ceremonies, but they were also worn into battle. Must have been tough on those delicate feathers. This rather poignant portrait on the right was a Hawaiian princess dressed in a feather cape for the funeral of her parents, who had died on a trip to London. I've mentioned that only Hawaiian chiefs could wear the sacred feather cap. The patterns on the cape were created to reflect the intended wearer's lineage, and they included symbols related to his clan, a little bit like heraldic shields in Europe. Traditionally, feather cape creators, recited the genealogy of the wearer. So they wove the story of the family and the story of the individual into the patterns of the garment. Should have edited my notes more carefully. There's still a lot of mystery and uncertainty surrounding this ancient site of Nan Madol in Pohnpei, Micronesia, but it seems to have been an elite center where the nobility resided and mortuary activities were presided over by priests. It's thought that maybe it served in part as a way that the ruling Sadalur chiefs could organize and control potential rivals by requiring essentially their nobles to live in the city rather than their home districts, where therefore their activities were difficult to monitor. Stay tuned for the Palace of Versailles, where King Louis XIV used a very similar strategy to keep his nobles in line. It would not surprise me to see the College Board draw that parallel. So I've already showed you the Maori chief with his very impressive tattoos, marks that would have sent clear and readily interpreted signals about his status and mana to people in his own culture. By the way, by the time this was painted, he was also a leader in New Zealand's Methodist Church. Body art actually plays a central role in both African and Pacific culture. In the middle, you see a Samoan hand tattoo. That's a current picture. And the woman on the right was from the Kuba tribe of the Congo Basin. This is an older photo. This is the tribe, by the way, that produced the Ndok portrait. In Africa, body art more commonly took the form of what's called scarification. And that's also, by the way, true of Maori tattoos, which are gouged into the skin. But others are made by injecting dye with needles. That's more common in other parts of the Pacific. So why would body art be so important in these two regions? Well, one answer, I think, is pretty simple. These are warm climates, so people didn't wear a lot of clothes. Body art served the same function, basically, as beautiful textiles in northern climates, although these cultures produced beautiful textiles as well. I'm actually a little peeved that no African textiles were included on the list of required works, since I find much of this cloth exquisite, and it is, in fact, produced by women artists. I've stuck an example of Ghanaian kente cloth on the bottom of the slide just to whet your appetite to learn more. Again, this is art produced almost entirely by women. So in Pacific cultures, too, men generally carved and women wove, but this time we get to see the weaving. What's especially fascinating about this work, the staff god, is how it combines male and female elements. The wooden core, which is made by male carvers, has a large head at one end and originally ended in a large penis, representing male virility and fertility. The missionaries made the islanders cut the penises off these gods, shocked them. But some scholars believe that the other figures facing outward could depict women in childbirth, so essentially you have both sides of the fertility story. The bark cloth made by women not only protects the ancestral power, again, that is mana, but it also contains it within different layers. So it's a kind of protection for the god and for the mana or spirit that the god contains. So I've already talked about Mulligan funeral rituals. And in fact, Mulligan display also relates to the culture's coming of age rituals. This would be a great work to use if you were asked about the use of art and ritual. So after several months of training in seclusion, remember that same policies followed by the Sande societies of the Mende people in Africa, young men and women are presented in public and given these carved and painted figures. The initiation ceremonies that follow include creating these special houses to hold images. So it's used for funerary and coming of age purposes. And in fact, we will look at an African funerary work that is also repurposed as a coming of age image. In fact, you have a quiz question about it. I noticed that a disproportionate number of the College Board sample questions on Pacific art seem to involve materials, probably because islanders were so dependent on native materials to create art, but also because the materials, as I've indicated, often had a spiritual significance. The stone logs of the Nan-Madol complex are actually a form of columnar basalt. Basically, the rock breaks in this pattern. The columns form when flowing lava spreads several feet over a large area. So the lava cools from the top down as it loses heat to the atmosphere, and it cools from the bottom up as it loses heat to the ground below, but not as much in the middle. And the result is a crack that really forms something that looks a lot like a log. The people of Nan-Madol, in fact, use these columns in the same fashion that many mainland cultures have used logs for buildings. The basalt columns were a lot heavier. That's the downside. On the other hand, they survived centuries as an indicator of the industry and sophistication of the people who built what are essentially these artificial islands on a coral reef. By the way, archaeologists still debate how the people of this artificial island managed to move these huge stones over water. Similar debate about Easter Island and, of course, about the pyramids and Stonehenge. How do they do it before the wheel, before the internal combustion engine, before steam engines? It's amazing. These works, however, are really exceptions. Stone is not as uncommon in the Pacific as it is in African art, but we still see more art constructed of wood, feathers, sea creatures, and fiber. I mentioned this earlier, bark cloth weaving is a female art and very important in Pacific cultures. I'm going to leave it up to the presenters to describe the complex way in which these works were created. So note this procession of women bringing a gift of cloth to the queen. An interesting choice of work, and one that's been questioned, someone on the listserv. But does it remind you of any other procession that's depicted in this course? Another procession that in fact involves a gift of cloth? Think Athens. Feather cloaks and capes were symbols of power and social standing in Hawaiian culture. Again, only high-ranking chiefs or warriors of great ability were entitled to wear them. Both feathers and color red were associated with gods, and the cape symbolized the king's religious responsibilities, and it also conveyed his divinity. Note the natural elements that make up the book mask, including feathers. Okay, stay tuned for Paul Gauguin, another painter who lived in the South Pacific in his later years. He took great inspiration from Pacific culture, and in exchange he infected a large number of local girls with syphilis, the disease that eventually killed him. Cultural exchange was not necessarily kinder to the people of the Pacific than it was to the people of Africa. Think of that punitive expedition of 1897 to Benin. And remember our corned beef bowl, where native foods were replaced by tinned corned beef as a ceremonial festival meat, which actually I find kind of intriguing. And that finishes up my introduction. You will not hear the disembodied voice again until the test review podcast. And then when we turn to our next unit, on early Christian art. But I'll be thinking of you as I snorkel and hike, at least from time to time.